everybody. If you want to humor me and scan this QR code and pull up a browser tab to participate in this presentation, that should be fun. And we'll get started and test this. So let me start the first poll here and tell me how you feel about all of this. You're attending a privacy talk at an AppSec conference. You excited? Not so much? Let's see what the results are. 5 votes are in. All right. Sweet. That's better than I expected. So I think I overheard that they're starting the bar at 3:45. So that's our goal. So let's get going here. My name is David Ochel. Thanks for the intro, Joe. The 2 things I want to point out here is, we're talking about things that border onto legal topics, and I'm not a lawyer, and nothing I'm going to say here is going to be legal advice. So if you need legal advice, find a lawyer. And any of the examples we're going to look at are fictional. I made those up. So things we want to talk about today is privacy impact assessments, or really looking, how do we look at privacy risk? And we'll get started by looking at something that we're familiar with, which is security risk assessments. And so, in order to assess risk, what are we really looking for? We're trying to anticipate how our security goals could be violated, right? What could happen that violates these goals. We're all familiar with those: confidentiality, integrity, availability, sometimes other ones that people throw in the mix. So let's assess one. So let's assume we are an online merchant and we take credit card payments on the internet, right? And our security posture is not super great. We patch our database monthly, but we don't have a firewall in front of it. And so the threat that we're modeling here right now is that an adversary comes, exploits the vulnerability in our database, steals all the cardholder data, and sells it on the black market. And then what that would mean is the hypothetical exposure to us, right, is banks experience fraud. We might get fined by the PCI Council, our customers unhappy, and so we estimate that maybe our damages coming out of that might be $2 million if it happens ever. And we think maybe it'll happen every 10 years. So if we break this down to an annualized loss, 200K a year is our risk exposure, right? So the question for you all is, what are we going to do about this? And so I'm going to start the next poll here. And let's see what our options are. So you could say that's fine, right? We make so much money out of this. We can easily assume the risk of losing 200K a year through a data breach. Or you could say, we could implement a firewall, and that reduces the likelihood of us being exploited. And so our annualized loss expectancy rate goes down to 40K a year. Or the third option I'm giving you here, if you want to participate in the poll, we'll outsource it to a card processor. And so on our webpage, it's just an iframe that sends all the processing to the processor. We don't store any cardholder data anymore in our database, and that's how we reduce the risk. Has everybody voted? Anybody still voting? Going once, going twice? There are the results. Yeah, that's along the lines of what my answer would have been too. So what did we just do? We did a risk assessment, right? So on the left here, we looked at what does our threat look like? Vulnerability in the database could be exploited by who, what would happen, and then we evaluate this risk and say, well, what's the likelihood and what would be the consequence, the potential impact be? And Do we have any controls in place? We patch the database once a month. And so we model the risk, and then we make a risk treatment decision. We say, yeah, we can accept the risk. It's within our risk tolerance. Or we could say, let's avoid the risk. Let's just stop taking cardholder data. Usually not a good business decision. We could say transfer the risk, like get cyber insurance. Charisse was talking about that earlier this morning. Or we can mitigate the risk and say, we're going to implement additional controls, a firewall or something else, outsourcing. If we decide to mitigate the risk, do something about it, then what we'll do after that is to look at the residual risk, right? We're saying, okay, let's say we're implementing a firewall. What's the risk going to look like once that firewall has been implemented? So we're predicting that the risk then is going to be hopefully somewhere where it's going to be acceptable to us, and that's the residual risk. So this should look familiar. That's how we do security risk assessments. Make sense? Any questions? Cool. Let's look at privacy impact analysis and what that looks like. And if you just joined us, if you want to participate, you can scan this QR code with your phone and participate in our little studies here. That's a lot of text. I'll explain it to you. So let's assume we have a platform that works with item tracking devices, right? Those little things that you can slip in your backpack or glue to your bicycle or your car. And then any time a participating phone with Bluetooth walks by it, you can get an update on its location. So here is a hypothetical threat we want to look at. So you track your consumers and where their stuff is, and they tell you in your platform what type of item it is, roughly, right? Is it a bicycle? Is it a car? Is it a laptop? And so you've got pretty good statistics about how frequently they lose these things, because every time they lose one of these, they flag it as lost in your platform. And you see that in average, this happens to a person maybe every 15 years that they lose something valuable. But you also see that there's about 10% of your customers, and to them that happens pretty frequently. For whatever reason, they lose stuff left and right, or it gets stolen. So interesting to see that, right? And because you want to keep the prices low for your customers, you sell these statistics onward to data aggregators, including identifying information. So the potential exposure here is that the next time one of those customers, who are like the more risky people who lose all of their stuff all the time, goes and shops for like homeowners insurance, the quotes they get back for premiums is like $200 more than what their friends are seeing in terms of premiums. And that happens, you think maybe it happens about like 2% of your users a year. So the question is, what are we going to do about that, if anything? So if you want to look at your phones, you can choose from these answers. So you could just say, we're going to go on as is, we don't talk about it. Or you could say, well, let's add it to our privacy policy, and that way at least we disclose to our customers what we're doing. Or you could say, disclose it and offer an opportunity to opt out of this data sale. Or you could say, disclose it and don't do it until a customer has opted in. And maybe you give them an incentive for opting in, who knows. So let's see how everybody voted. Ha-ha. Cool. So
that may be what we prefer, not what it is for you.
Yes. So we just did another risk assessment, right? But so the question is, what has changed in the way we look at risk? Anybody? We have little goodies. If you speak up, you get goodies.
So is it changing the context instead of the risk being a loss to the business and a loss to the user?
Uh-huh. Yes, exactly. What else? All right. Well, so a couple things changed, right? So our perspective changed. When we look at this risk, we're not looking at what's going to be the consequences for us as a business if this happens. Like you just said, we're looking at what's the consequence to the individual whose personal data we process. And so if you think about it, the adversary, the type of adversary has changed. All of a sudden, it's us as the company selling the service whose practice is actually creating exposure for our consumers. And, you know, sure, could also still be like a bad guy and it's a data breach, and that might also be privacy relevant. But so there's different adversaries at play here. The types of harm that we consider change. So in our example, we still looked at like economic loss, right? I have to pay like a higher premium for insurance, but it could also be that as a result of somebody processing my data, I lose a limb or die, or you know, I just get intimidated or embarrassed. So those are kinds of harms that aren't necessarily economical when we look at privacy risk. And the last thing I think that changes is the toolbox we have available to mitigate some of these risks. So we talked about, you know, opt-ins and opt-outs and privacy notices. So that's there's some overlap, but there's also different things we can do in the privacy space than in security. What hasn't changed? What did not change between this and our earlier risk assessment about the cardholder data breach? Any guesses? So the decision maker, it's still the company that's processing the data that decides, oh, is what we're doing appropriate or not, and do we want to make it more appropriate, or is it okay? So that's interesting, right? The individual is at risk, but the organization makes the decision. And of course, I think as probably is obvious to all of us, we're still doing a risk assessment, and the general methodology has not changed. We model the threat, and maybe we call the threat agent a data controller instead, because it's the person deciding what happens with the data. And maybe because we don't want to talk about like adversarial actions, we call it problematic data actions that might occur. And then we're looking at, okay, what's the likelihood of this happening? And what's the potential harm to an individual if this happens? And then we decide, is what we're doing appropriate? You know, privacy people often talk about proportionality. And do we want to do anything to change it, mitigate it, or not? Make sense so far? I put up here, you know, risk assessments are really about reducing uncertainty about what might happen in terms of our goals being violated, right? And we looked earlier at the security goals, CIA. So the question then is, what are our privacy goals? And so privacy goals are maybe not as uniformly codified as security goals, I want to say. They vary a little bit more in the definitions depending on where you look. But so really common principles are the Fair Information Practice Principles, FIPPS, FIPS. And those we find reflected in laws over the world and codes. So what are they? They are purpose specification. If you process somebody's personal data, you need to be specific about which purpose you're doing this for. And then you need to limit the collection of your data to that purpose. Only collect what you need to achieve that purpose. You need to make sure that the data is accurate. If you base decisions on the data that affect the individual, then it better be accurate. You need to limit its use, only use it for the stated purpose, and only keep it around for as long as you need it for that purpose. Security is still a topic. We still need to keep the data secure, right? Confidentiality, integrity, availability, that still matters. Transparency, openness. Tell your customers or employees what you're doing with that data, what kind of data you're collecting, for what purpose, and let them participate. Number 7 here. Offer individuals a way to ask for, hey, what kind of data do you have about me? Or like, who did you give this to? Individual participation. And lastly, be accountable for what you're doing. And so accountability is more than just, having like your legal address on a privacy notice. It's like actually making sure that you adhere to these principles and you have policies in place internally and processes so that you can show to whoever is asking, yes, I'm doing all the right things, here's my documentation. Does that make sense? Any questions? Cool. I should have said earlier, I uploaded my slides to Shed, so the scheduling app, if you want a copy, they're on there as a PDF. So you don't need to take notes if you don't want to. So I wanted to briefly talk, because that's a pet peeve of mine, about the different names we give risk assessments in the privacy space. And you can see here, it's a little hard to read, but the sources are mostly legislation, but not always. And many of these, including the more recent state legislations in the US, California and Colorado and Virginia, they all have provisions for saying you need to do some sort of privacy risk assessment. But they all call it different names. And it's all the same. So what I'm trying to get at is, like, I usually use the term privacy impact assessment, and I don't mean to be specific about any of this context. And I think many people do the same. And so if somebody comes to you and says, PJ, can you help me do a privacy impact assessment? Your next question, okay, what's the context? Like, who's asking for it? In which of these? There might be methodologies implied. There might be different definitions of privacy goals that could be violated. So you need to understand the context. And don't assume that because somebody is using the term data protection impact assessment, they necessarily mean that it's the one that's referred to in the GDPR. Always ask for context. There's a new industry term too, at the bottom here, data transfer impact assessments or third country assessments. I wanted to briefly look at that because I think it's just really interesting to understand. So if you haven't yet and want to scan this QR code and participate, go ahead, do it. It's gonna be, we're wandering more into the legal aspects of privacy goals here. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but I'll try to explain this the layman's way. Here is the deal. You are a US headquartered SaaS solution that lets companies process their job applications with. So if you want to apply for a job of one of your clients, at one of your clients' companies, you use the SaaS platform to put in your job application and then hit the send button, and the employer gets a job application. And while you are headquartered here in the US, you have European clients, and you make sure to store data from the European clients and job applicants only on European servers. Make sense so far? So here's the hypothetical problem we're trying to model. it could happen that you receive a request from the US government that says, hey, give me all the data you have about this one person in Europe that has used your platform. And you think that maybe happens to you once a year. The potential privacy harm we're looking at is this. The EU regulations, the GDPR, basically says if you ask for somebody's data, it needs to be for a specific purpose and it needs to be proportionate. US law that allows, counterterrorism or law enforcement to ask for data secretly from a company doesn't say it needs to be purpose limited and proportionate. So there's a conflict there. And the other thing that's a problem, as far as Europeans are concerned, is job applicants whose data you might give to law enforcement or whoever, they can't know about it, right? It's supposed to be secret, and so they can't challenge that what we're doing is proportionate or ask for a copy of what you gave law enforcement. So we are violating privacy goals afforded to Europeans by the GDPR by doing this. So the question is, remember we're a SaaS provider, what are we going to do about it? So let's start another poll. And let's look at our options here. So on your phone you can vote. You could either say, well, it's not my problem, right? It's like my European clients are companies that pay me for this service, and it's their job applicants, so they have to worry about that, not my problem. Or you could say, it's not a problem at all, that the US government can't compel me to get them data from one of my servers that are located in Europe. Or you could say, well, let's just add it to our privacy policy so that clients and job applicants know about it, and so we told them, we're being transparent about it. Or you could say, let's implement a complicated encryption scheme where customers can hold encryption keys that allow them and their job applicants to decrypt the data, but while it's stored on our servers, it's encrypted with a reasonably strong mechanism. And so even if somebody comes and asks us for a copy of that data, we can give them the encrypted data, but we can't decrypt it for them. Or, last option here, you could say, I need to hire a lawyer to figure this one out. Has everybody voted? Yes, okay. Okay, cool. So I am not a lawyer, so technically the only answer I can tell you is right is the last one there, but let's talk about the other options briefly too. So you could say that's not my problem, and technically that's true, right? You're just acting on the instruction of your European clients, but the European clients are going to go somewhere else if you don't help them solve that issue, right? They're going to find a provider that can help them solve this issue. The next one, if you look at the US Cloud Act, so this one isn't true. The Cloud Act says even if your data are outside of the country, I can ask you for it if I'm here in the US and have the legal right to do that. The third one solves the issue about transparency. It might happen, but it doesn't solve the issue about is it proportionate, limited to a purpose, and can you as the individual whose data is being forwarded actually do something about it or ask about it. So it doesn't really solve the problem. The encryption scheme, I think that might actually work. Yeah, I would probably also go to a lawyer. So that's where you see, it gets out of the hand of us techies and can get really complicated. But I decided to include this example because there's such a big deal right now about international data transfer. And if you hadn't looked into it yet, Now you know why. And does this actually happen? There was an interesting blog article from TechRobot the other day who looked at the responsible disclosure reports from Facebook and Apple and Twitter and compiled numbers. And you can see, yes, these requests happen. So it is an actual problem. And, you know, is it likely to happen to somebody? I don't know. But when the Europeans all say, oh man, how can we still transfer data to US service providers? That's what they're talking about and are worried about. So, next thing I wanted to do is to put together a little toolbox for you all. So, if we actually want to assess privacy impacts in a more methodic manner, are there any tools we can use? What can we look at? And so again, there's a copy of the slides in chat. You can download it and click on the links I've added to most of these slides. You don't need to write them down. So first question is like, when is actually the right timing to do, you know, a privacy impact assessment? And so, you know, I'm going to ask back to you as the application security professionals, when do you do threat modeling for your applications? Earlier is better, right? Ideally before a product hits the market, but it's never too late either. There is an interesting concept called privacy threshold analysis that you might want to think about. That, you know, when I think about software development life cycles and DevOps, maybe that could work, where basically you say, I have these 5 or 10 questions that an application or product owner should be able to answer, and that'll tell me as the privacy person whether there's a potential high risk on the privacy side or not. And if there isn't, I just let them be and do their thing. If there's a red flag, then I might come and say, hey, product owner, can we do a privacy impact assessment? And then last thing here, sure, when the law requires it. And if you look at all these different legal statutes that say you should think about privacy risks, many of them imply that you do it before you start an activity. But of course, especially in Europe, if you already have processes in place and they are risky in terms of like privacy impact, you should still go back and do it because they might still come and ask for it. How do we categorize problematic data actions? Right? Those of you who have done threat modeling before in like, you know, using methodologies like Microsoft's Stride or whatnot, they all give you like categories of threats to help you think about what could happen. And so similar, there's a couple of places we can look for where people have already thought about what might be types of problematic data actions that could happen. There is a methodology from NIST called Privacy Risk Assessment Methodology, PRAM, that has a list. There's also a frequently cited paper from Dan Sullivan that also tries to think about, well, problematic data actions. So it could be surveillance, could be, I don't know, data aggregation, identifying, you know, de-identified data again with individuals, all sorts of things. And then, of course, also security issues, right? Like a data breach could happen and then somebody's personal data gets leaked to the world, and that's also a problematic data action. So there's some catalogs to check into. And then same question on the privacy harm side, how can we categorize the potential harm that an individual might experience as a result of the problematic data action that we are responsible for? And so there's again a catalog in NIST PRAM. There's a paper here again from Solovi and Keats. So those are some places to start at. So just if you look at some of these harms, We brushed over this earlier. Could be physical harm. Maybe a car crashed because, I don't know, it's not personal data, maybe not. Economic harms, that's what's obvious to all of us. Could lose money, could be reputation, could be discrimination, could be relationships in your private life or with your employer and in public life. Could be psychological harms. You get distressed about people surveilling you, and that's causing you impact. And then there's a whole list of autonomy harms. Somebody could get personal data about you and try to manipulate you, or in terms of voting, maybe, who knows, or coercion or blackmail. So some catalogs that can get us started. And then, what are the controls available, the technical or organizational measures we can use to reduce privacy impact we might be causing? There's two buzzwords that, if you're interested, you can dive into. One is privacy by design, and so those are really process principles for how can we design applications and processes with privacy in mind. Things like, privacy options, any settings you have that impact a person's data that's being processed, the default should always be privacy-minded. The default should always be, we don't do it until you opt in, etc. And then the second thing here is privacy-enhancing technologies, PETs. And so that's a whole not super well categorized rat tail of availability of technical measures you could use. It starts with, let's just not collect the data, or once we have identity proofed you, let's delete your social security number instead of storing it in our database forever. It could be what's called pseudonymization. Let's keep identifiers over here in a data silo and other data that we need for statistics somewhere else, and we only re-identify, put those together if we need to, but we keep them in different silos. Aggregation, trying to anonymize data, is a thing. Encrypting data and transfer and storage is also a privacy-enhancing technology. Decentralizing storage, can we figure out how to store somebody's personal data only on their phone so that it's not all in our database? Last example I put in here is if we publish data sets, can we introduce randomness so that it's easier, that it's harder for adversaries to say, oh, this data belongs to David. And there's more, so something else to look into. Are there any tools that do all of this for us? I put a couple pointers in here, and remember that we need to think about context. So for example, the French Privacy Supervisory Authority has an actual tool you can use to do privacy impact assessments that meet that agency, CNIL's interpretation of what's required under GDPR for privacy impact assessments. So for that context, you could look at that. We mentioned NIST's methodology. If you're interested in transfer impact assessments, again, probably go hire a lawyer, but the IAPP has published some Excel templates you can play with. And of course, there's lots of commercial tools that tell you that they'll automate it for you and do it all by themselves without you even looking at it. But so here's some things to look into. And then last slide on this is if you found this interesting today and want to learn more about privacy, where can you go to learn more about privacy in general? I put some links on here. You can click on them later. So let's recap. Why in the world would we want to do all of this in the first place? Anybody? What motivates us to do this? Yes.
Morality, ability.
Yes, have some pens, please. Do you want to hand out pens? Sure. Anything else? Who saw Dan Cornell's keynote this morning? Yeah, so it was like really when he said, yeah, at the end of the day, the only thing that motivates corporations is like money. I think that's probably true. But I also like to think morality, right? And there's things that you can turn into incentives for you as a company, like establishing customer trust. Maybe your clients ask you for it. Charisse, in her talk earlier today, like she was like, said she had seen cyber insurance giving lower premiums to companies if they had done a data protection impact assessment. I was like, oh, cool. But yeah, at the end of the day, we want it to be about morality and respecting privacy as an essential human right. But it might be the legal fines, whatever, that motivate us at the end of the day. So just to make this analogy one more time, because that's what I really was trying to get at today, why am I talking about this at an AppSec conference, right? It's, if you look at the upper right here and look at how we do security threat modeling in AppSec, we look at our security goals, we look at, okay, what's our application actually look like, and what threats are there that could violate these goals? How can we mitigate them? We should probably test the mitigation once we've implemented it, and then we start over, right? And it's exactly the same thing on the privacy side. We look at what are the privacy goals, where all do we process personal data, where does it go, what are the potential problematic data actions and harms we can cause to individuals by doing this, and is there a way we can mitigate it, and then we go in the circle. And then of course, usually outside of the realm of the pure AppSec persons, there is like a corporate risk management function that then looks at this and says, okay, what's the risk to us, as a company, when we try to translate this into dollars? And are we doing enough, or are we not doing enough about it? But so it's, pretty similar. And so to summarize once more, privacy impact assessments look at the potential for violating privacy goals. I think for us techies, it's always important to keep in mind that privacy goals can be, violated not just on the technical side, but also on the process side. I can do stuff with data that's not in an application, and that can still be an issue. So good to keep that in mind. And so again, we're looking at the harm done to individuals. Primarily, we're not supposed to look at, oh, if we do this, can we get away with it? Might we get a fine? That's not the intent of a privacy impact assessment. Minimize the impact where you can, and then assess the risk. Is what we're doing proportionate with the purpose? Is the reason we're doing this for appropriate for the risks we're creating for our customers or employees or whoever the individuals are whose data we're processing? And then like we just said, at the end of the day, sure, it always translates into corporate risks too, right? But in the regulatory space, if somebody comes and says, hey, where's your privacy impact assessments? They care about the first four bullets, not about the fifth. And then what I also put in here, I really think these first three things, that is things where we as AppSec practitioners can we can help with that. We can look at that. We understand where the data is. And, you know, threat modeling, privacy impact modeling, we can totally help with that and take initiative. When it comes down to assessing, okay, what's the risk if we get sued or have a data breach or whatever, that's probably not our job. That's where the executives and risk managers and lawyers are on the hook. But there's some things we can do if we're interested in doing that. Does that all make sense? Any questions? Okay, I have one last doodle, and then we're done. So let's assume for a moment you're a startup, and what you're trying to do is digitize the way that people prove their age when they buy goods that are age restricted, like liquor or cigarettes or whatever, right? And so let's just assume that you think you can convince whoever government is issuing IDs to their citizens that you can do that as a trusted third party. So you have a plan on how you can do that. You basically enroll new customers in your app by letting them scan their ID, and then you run that through an identity verification provider to make sure it's a real ID, it's them. Those services exist, no problem. And then we say, okay, so usually an issue is account recovery. Somebody forgets their credentials, and you say, okay, we'll just keep these scanned IDs on file, and if somebody forgets their credentials for the app, they can just re-upload a scan of their ID, we compare it to what we have on file, and then we let them back in. And on the merchant side, if a customer walks into a store and wants to buy a bottle of tequila, they can use the app to scan a customer's QR code, and then on their end get presented the date of birth and the address and a photo of the customer. And so that way they don't need to have their driver's license or passport or whatever on them. They can just use their phone. And of course, for stats, for statistics purposes, you will keep a log of all interactions between merchants and customers. Make sense so far? So my question for you all is there anything we can do to make this more privacy-minded? And we want to enable the business, right? So we don't want to say we can't do this at all. So if you look at your phones, you have options there, and this is a multiple choice one, so you can choose multiple of these answers, and you gotta hit the submit button in the lower right corner once you've chosen. But so let's look at our options. You could say I scan the IDs at the beginning, but then I don't store them. If somebody needs to recover their account because they forgot their credentials, they can just rescan their ID, and we just send it through the identity verification provider again, and maybe that'll cost us a couple of cents, but that way we don't have like a database of IDs sitting around. You could say, second one here, well, all we need to show to the merchant is really the age, or not even that. You could also just say, is the person old enough or not to buy your goods? You don't need to show them the date of birth or their photo or their address. Merchant doesn't need to know that. Or you could say, all these logs of customer and merchant interactions, we're going to aggregate them so that nobody can go in that database anymore and see how many times David went to the liquor store this week. Or you could say, hey, let's do a pen test and make sure that our infrastructure is secure so that personal data we're processing is less likely to be exposed in a data breach. Or you could say, let's put a data processing agreement in place with our identity verification providers so that we specify exactly what they can do with the data that we send to them and what not. So if all of you have voted, let's look at the options and votes. Anybody still voting? Okay. Yeah, I too think all of these are good options. But so a lot of this is more like on the technical side, you can actually do things to minimize privacy risk to individuals, right? So there's a little bit of legalese at the bottom there, but there's a lot of technical things we can do as well. That's all I had to say, but I'm happy to answer any questions if you guys have any. Okay. Say again?
When is the US going to adopt the GDPR?
That's a very good question. I was actually at a privacy conference last week, and somebody was like, okay, so how far away are we from national privacy legislation in the US? And the people there also just had ideas. Probably not next year.
Google and Facebook have really good lobbyists.
Yeah. Cool.
Courage and motivation.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thanks everybody. You are welcome to follow up with me, questions, anything.